And I'm really honoured to, can you not hear me? Maybe that's better? Can you hear me now? No? Okay. How about now? Yes, fantastic. Sorry, I probably got a quiet voice. I was just saying, great thank you really to the organising committee for the chance to come and show you my most recent work. So I'm going to talk today about the large-scale cortical organisation of the semantic system. And the theme running through my talk is the idea that the topographical organisation of the networks that support semantic cognition helps us to better understand their function, their contribution to this important aspect of our cognition. I'm going to focus my talk on semantic cognition, but at a few points I'll also try to note along the way where there might be implications for understanding cognition more generally. Okay, so when I talk about semantic cognition, what I mean is our ability to produce adaptive thoughts and behaviour that are kind of well suited to what we're trying to achieve in the world. And successful semantic cognition obviously means we need to be able to access a store of conceptual information in long-term memory. And the idea is that concepts are abstracted away from sensory motor features. For example, for the concept dog, you have lots of different features that you encounter when you interact with dogs. You know what they look like, what they sound like, what they smell like, and so on. And every time you encounter a dog, you can extract information from these diverse situations to form a more abstract representation that integrates these different elements together. And so that's the sort of hub and spoke account of conceptual representation. But we also believe that this long-term store of concepts isn't sufficient for successful semantic cognition. And that's because for any given concept, you've got lots of different features, and you have to flexibly compile your concepts in different ways depending on the circumstances. So, for example, normally a dog might be positively valenced, that you might have a dog at home who you love as part of your household. Even if you don't have a pet dog, you might know that dogs are man's best friend and so on. But in some contexts, like the context of police or border control or something like that, then of course dogs have different features which make them quite scary. So the valence of dog here can change according to the circumstances. And we think that there are distinct processes in the brain which support our ability to flexibly change what we're doing with our conceptual information. So I'm going to refer to these as semantic control processes. And the idea is that we need more semantic control when the information that's most accessible in the long-term semantic store is not the information that we need at a given moment. So we can flexibly push around the knowledge we're retrieving to suit our goals or perhaps the circumstances. If we've been in a certain context and it's primed features which are no longer relevant for what we're trying to do. So there's a bit of a puzzle here. How do we achieve the competing demands of forming abstract concepts from very diverse situations where we've encountered the same kind of concepts? And yet at the same time, having made these abstract representations of the meanings of things, then use those to generate very diverse and flexible behaviours. And I'm going to argue that the topographical organisation of the networks which support semantic cognition provides one way to think about this puzzle. So my talk's going to have three different parts to it. In the first part, I'll talk about the anterior temporal lobes. It's where I started my own journey in thinking about semantic cognition. And I'll talk about an account of semantic representation, which is referred to as the graded hub account. This idea suggests that the anterior temporal lobes receive multiple types of inputs, for example, visual inputs, auditory inputs, and valence via the uncinate fasciculus into the temporal pole. And then this information is gradually integrated to form more and more heteromodal representations, so that the heteromodal peak, if you like, of the semantic hub in the anterior temporal lobes is the area that's equidistant and maximally distant from these different kinds of inputs. And that would be the area that's shown in white on the schematic there. So having talked about this idea that there's a topographical organisation in the anterior temporal lobes, I'll then turn my attention to the default mode network more generally. So the anterior temporal lobes partially overlap with the default mode network as identified by parcellations of intrinsic connectivity. The default mode network also has an interesting topographical relationship with sensory motor processing, and it's maximally separated from sensory motor input regions. So I'll talk about how that separation from sensory motor processes might be important for understanding the functions of the default mode network. And then towards the end of my talk, I'll consider the other networks that support semantic cognition. And I'll talk about the semantic control network, which shows a stronger response when people have to retrieve maybe more unusual aspects of concepts or aspects of concepts which are not readily accessible in the semantic store. And we noticed quite early on that this semantic control network is topographically situated in between the default mode network and areas of the brain which are associated with domain general executive control, regions that John Duncan describes as the multiple demand network. And so I'll suggest that this topographical location of the semantic control network is also important for its function, allowing it to integrate goal states stored in executive regions with long-term memory representations. So the idea that we have a heteromodal conceptual hub in the anterior temporal lobe really partly came about from the work that Carolyn Patterson and John Hodges and colleagues were doing on semantic dementia patients. And we know that semantic dementia patients have difficulties accessing conceptual information across a very wide range of tasks. It doesn't matter what the input or the output modalities are, or indeed what the task demands are. They show a high degree of correlation between different tasks. So if a particular patient is bad at a verbal task, they'll also be bad at the picture task and so on. And each individual patient also shows a high degree of consistency in which concepts they can access. And that suggests that there might be heteromodal concepts in the anterior temporal lobes which are being affected by the atrophy in this condition, giving rise to this very general semantic impairment. Of course, there's also convergent evidence from neuroimaging studies. This is an old example, just contrasting the response to verbal and picture-based semantic judgments in different parts of the anterior temporal lobes. So we have a succession of ROIs here going from the more superior parts, anterior STG, round into the lateral surface as you go from left to right, and then finally into the most medial parts of the anterior temporal lobes. And what you can see is that the preference that these regions show for different input modalities changes, with the more superior parts preferring auditory and verbal inputs, and the more medial parts preferring visual inputs and picture inputs, and the lateral and sort of ventral parts of the anterior temporal lobe not showing any preference. They respond across modalities, suggesting that these more ventral and lateral parts of the anterior temporal lobe might be the center of the heteromodal hub. So I'm just going to show you a more recent example of how we've been looking at functional subdivisions within the anterior temporal lobe. It's not the best quality work, but I thought it would interest some people that I thought would be in the room. So in this study, we've been measuring the distance between different ROIs. These are parcels from the Glasser parcellation. We've been measuring the distance of these parcels to the sensory motor landmarks. We've got the distance to the calcarine sulcus and the distance to the temporal transverse sulcus, measured here in millimeters from the different ROIs. And you can see that there's a systematic shift, as you'd expect, in terms of distance to these input regions, with the yellow parcel on the lateral and ventral surface showing the most equidistance between these inputs. So this seems to have some relevance for the functional distinctions within the anterior temporal lobes, even in a purely verbal task here. So we're contrasting two types of judgments. We've got on the right-hand side, we've got feature matching judgments where people are making decisions about whether objects share a visual feature like color. And on the left-hand side, we've got more of a kind of global semantic association task. And you can see that it's actually the blue parcel that responds maximally across these tasks. So that's a medial part of the anterior temporal lobes. And this parcel is the only parcel really to respond to the visual feature matching task, which kind of makes sense if it's closest, has greatest proximity to the visual cortex. Its response across both tasks might reflect the fact that visual features are important in different kinds of semantic tasks with very visual animals. In contrast, the regions of the anterior temporal lobe that are more towards the superior end, so the anterior STG in particular, but also the next couple of parcels, show a significant difference between these tasks. So they either show more activation for the global association task, or they show less deactivation. Excuse me. And this might reflect the fact that these more auditory parcels are supporting aspects of semantic cognition which are more based in language. So there's a possible example here of how the anterior temporal lobe might have different functional subdivisions within it based on topographical relationships and in particular distance to different primary systems. So moving on to the second part of my talk now, I'm going to consider whether this organizational principle relating to the distance to unimodal landmarks might relate to the function of the brain more widely. And this is work that was led by Daniel Margulies, and he was interested in measuring the distance on the cortical surface from different parts of the brain to three different landmarks. We've got the central sulcus, which characterizes the location of motor and somatosensory cortex, then the calcarine sulcus for vision, and the temporal transverse sulcus for auditory inputs. And the image on the left-hand side shows the distance, the cortical global minimum distance to any of these landmarks across the brain surface. And you can see that the red hotspots are areas where the brain is maximally distant from these different inputs, and they correspond quite nicely to the areas where the default mode network has peak responses. The functional relevance for this distance from sensory motor inputs is captured by what we call the principal gradient of intrinsic connectivity. So the principal gradient of intrinsic connectivity is derived from resting state fMRI data, and it's capturing the key dimension, the dimension that explains the most variance within connectivity space. And because this map's going to be quite important in some of the studies I'll present subsequently, I'll just spend a moment telling you how it was derived. So this is an analysis where we have 400 parcels, and we can look at the pairwise connectivity between these parcels, just in terms of the time series correlation. So we've got a 400 by 400 matrix of connectivity, and then we do a decomposition of this matrix to find the principal dimensions of connectivity space. And the one that explains the most variance is the one that's shown here, and it clearly captures the separation between heteromodal cortex shown in red and unimodal cortex shown in blue. Another thing that's fascinating about the principal gradient of connectivity is it seems to capture the order of networks in multiple parts of the brain as you move along the cortical surface. So that's the analysis on the right-hand side, where we can see that there's transitions along the principal gradient, starting at the sort of extreme apex with the default mode network, which is the network which is most distant from sensory motor inputs, then moving through the frontoparietal control network, which is the orange network, then through the attention networks, the dorsal attention and ventral attention networks, which are a bit further down the principal gradient towards the sensory motor end, and then finally reaching the primary system's motor and visual cortex. So if physical distance along the cortical surface is important for functional organization, we might be able to show that individual differences in how far away individual people's primary landmarks are from parcels is predictive of their function. So this was an analysis that was done by Shui Wang, and she was using the data from the Human Connectome project, looking at two contrasts. One is the auditory story task, with the conjunction of that and the maths task, which is also auditorily presented. And then the other contrast she looked at was the story over maths task. Now, because these are essentially language tasks, language involves lots of different kinds of representations that go from sensory motor representations, which are important for language, right through to more abstract conceptual representations. And our expectations about how distance influences function will depend on what kind of representations we're talking about. So if we're dealing with auditory representations, we might expect greater proximity to auditory input regions would lead to an increased response in those parcels to auditory inputs. But conversely, if we're dealing with abstract concepts, we might imagine greater separation from sensory motor regions would allow greater abstraction of information to form these concepts and consequently might give rise to a stronger response. So Sherry first of all identified all of the parcels that responded to either of these two contrasts. And then she searched for parcels where there was a significant correlation between individual people's distance to the primary landmarks and the amount of activation for that contrast. And the parcels on the screen are the ones which were significant, correcting for multiple comparisons. And what you can see is parcels in a number of different networks here. First of all, we have primary and secondary auditory parcels, which all show a negative relationship between distance to auditory cortex, in this case, and activation. So the closer these parcels are, the more that they activate to the auditory inputs. Then we also have parcels of the language network and the default mode network that show the opposite relationship. So this time a positive correlation between distance and activation. So in participants for whom these parcels are further away from their sensory-motor landmarks, there's more activation in these networks, which are thought to have more abstract types of representations in them. And because there's relatively few parcels that pass the very stringent multiple correction that we applied, we also wanted to know if this pattern was true in general. So that's this last analysis I'm showing you, where we searched essentially all of the parcels which were significantly responding to the top contrast, where we've got representations that span the whole array from auditory to semantic. And we extracted the strength of the relationship between distance and activation for all of those parcels, and then asked if it flips from negative to positive as you move along the principal gradient. And the answer is yes, there's a systematic relationship in that correlation as you move along the gradient. Okay, so this view that cortical distance from sensory-motor landmarks relates to the functional organization of the cortex can help us to understand some of the kind of ongoing debates about the functional role of the default mode network. So one of the things that's tricky about the default mode network, of course, is it tends to deactivate to a lot of tasks, so it makes it quite hard to study. The other thing that's tricky about the default mode network is that it's implicated in a huge array of different kinds of cognition by different research groups. So this image on the left-hand side, again, it's from Daniel Margulies's paper. And here we're looking at maps derived from the Neurosynth meta-analytic tool and their correlation with the principal gradient. And you can see towards the bottom of this list a range of different functions that the the default mode network is associated with, including social cognition, of course, semantic cognition. We've got autobiographical memory. We've got things like reward-based decision-making, representation of value, and even cognitive control. So the default mode network's been associated with all of those different domains. And that makes it very difficult to know what's common across these different kinds of tasks. So the principal gradient gives us this hypothesis that what's common across all these different tasks is that they all require a degree of separation in what you're representing to support the task from the state of the world around us. So we need to have different representations in our sort of internal system that are driving cognition. And these representations have to be maintained even as the sensory-motor landscape around us changes. The principal gradient might also help us to resolve another debate that has been kind of long-running in the semantic literature, which concerns kind of which parts of the brain are important for heteromodal semantic cognition. And different research groups have tended to focus on different brain regions. So we've got the work from Matt Lambonov's group, including me, looking at the anterior temporal lobes, for example. But we also know that other brain regions are important for heteromodal processing in the semantic domain, such as the angular gyrus. And this is an old meta-analysis from Jeff Binder, a kind of landmark study, showing that actually, in terms of where the peaks in peak responses to semantic tasks are, there's more in the angular gyrus than there are in anywhere else, including the anterior temporal lobes. And of course, the principal gradient helps us to understand why there'll be lots of different brain regions which might show common responses to, for example, semantic cognition, because both of these sites and others might be very useful for integrating sensory-motor information in order to support heteromodal semantic processing. But that's not to say that these two regions will be identical in terms of their functions. And in fact, the principal gradient already makes some suggestions about the kinds of differences we might see. The anterior temporal lobes seems to be an ideal site for integrating visual, auditory, and valence information, which might be particularly critical for certain kinds of concepts. In contrast, the angular gyrus is probably particularly well situated for integrating auditory and visual inputs with motor representations. But it doesn't have such a clear input from the valence system, and the anterior temporal lobe is clearly further away from the motor cortex. So that's going to bias the kinds of responses in semantic tasks that you see in these different potential hub areas. So in the next part of the talk, I'm going to show you two different studies where we've looked at the functional significance at the top end of the principal gradient. And this first study was done in conjunction with Johnny Smallwood and led by a PhD student in our group at the time, Charlotte Murphy. And in this experiment, participants were asked to make 0 and 1 bag judgments about the locations of objects, meaningful objects, or color patches. So participants saw 2 images at a time, and these images changed every few seconds. And then sometimes, occasionally, they were asked to make a decision about them. So on the 0-back decisions, they were given an object in the middle of the screen with the 2 objects they had to decide about to the left and right. And they had to decide which object was the same as the one in the middle. So for example, here we've got a green apple, and we've got a red apple, and we've got an orange. So you have to choose the red apple goes with the green apple. On the 1-back trials, on the other hand, this time the information that you need to make the decision was no longer present in the external world. You had to use memory to retrieve the location of the relevant object. So, for example, this is a Labrador, and you had to match that to the Labrador that was presented on the previous trial. Now, the interesting thing here is that we can contrast, essentially, the difficulty of the task, because the 1-back decision moments are much more difficult, with the requirement to use memory to guide cognition. If the default mode network is important for memory-guided cognition, it should support the 1-back decisions, even though they're more difficult. We also contrasted these decisions about meaningful objects, which were essentially specific categorizations of pictures, with the color patch decisions, where there wasn't a meaningful object. People were presented, for example, with 2 blues and a green, and they just had to decide which color was more similar. What we found was that the top end of the principal gradient responds to both of these contrasts, really in quite a similar way. So it's as if the top end of the principal gradient likes to respond to both abstract concepts and meaningful objects, but also memory-guided decision-making over perceptual decision-making. And then in another analysis, what we did was a series of ROIs along the principal gradient. So this time we're looking at sort of bins, if you like, which are at the bottom of the principal gradient or a little bit further up or a bit further up again, a succession of ROIs moving along the cortical surface along the principal gradient. And you can see that it's the condition, the red condition, which is the object 1-back decisions, which particularly drive activation at the top of the gradient. So when you're trying to make abstract decisions based on memory, that's what really gets the default mode network especially excited. So if the default mode network sits at the top of this sort of information integration hierarchy, we should be able to increase the responsiveness of this network by increasing the range of features that are available to integrate. So this is a study, to test this hypothesis, Lucilla Lanzoni did a study looking at semantic decisions to words. And these words were ambiguous words. They were words like jam, which have 2 meanings. So it might be jam, the delicious kind of jam you have on your toast, or it might be that frustrating kind of jam you encounter on the motorway. In this case, they'd have to say jam goes with spoon, so it's the food type of jam that's being probed. And in order to disambiguate the meaning of these words, participants were presented with cues on the preceding slide. So there were different kinds of cues. They sometimes saw a facial portrayal of an emotion, such as a happy face for the delicious jam or a frustrated face for the motorway. Or they saw a spatial context photograph, such as a supermarket for the jam or a motorway for the traffic jam. Or they were presented with no cues. So we've got 2 cues, both cues are present, or only 1 cue is present, or there are no cues present. What we found was that the response to 1 cue over the 0 cue condition essentially elicits more activation in areas to do with working memory demand, the working memory demands of the task, maintaining the cues, and also visual cortex. But in contrast, the 2-cue integration condition over 1 cues gives us more activation towards the top of the gradient in the default mode network. So we've got angular gyrus, we've got right parts of lateral, anterior, or temporal cortex. We've got posterior cingulate cortex, medial prefrontal cortex, and so on. And this is the ROI analysis that's like the one in the previous study, looking at a succession of bins along the principal gradient. The effect of multiple cues is on the left-hand side. You can see it's essentially it's a linear increase as you go along the principal gradient here. There are also other spatial trends. It's a little bit complicated. The 1 cue over 0 cue contrast doesn't show that same pattern. So that's further evidence that the top end of the principal gradient, the default mode network, might be important for cue combination. So what we've got here is this idea that strong responses within the default mode network might emerge in situations where the relevant information you need for a task is highly accessible because it's been queued, or where there's multiple sources of kind of external constraint on what the system is doing. And in this kind of context, the default mode network can support semantic cognition that's appropriate for the task, even without having to draw on additional control networks. So just a kind of quick interim summary of the first two parts of the talk. We've shown that conceptual representation might involve heteromodal integration in the anterior temporal lobe and other default mode regions. We've seen some evidence that cortical function is correlated with physical distance from unimodal landmarks along the cortical surface. And the separation of the heteromodal and unimodal regions of the brain is a kind of key dimension of functional organization of the cortex. And this is captured by this principal gradient of intrinsic connectivity. And finally, I've shown you that both abstract kind of aspects of cognition involving semantic concepts and memory-guided cognition, that's where the information is not in the perceptual environment, are both types of cognition that draw on the top end of the gradient. Perhaps because in these situations we need to maintain representations that are separate from the external world. Okay, so having considered the role of the default mode network in semantic cognition and in some other kind of contexts, I want to turn my attention to other networks now, which also sometimes activate when we're performing semantic tasks. In particular, this middle green network here that I've termed the semantic control network, these are regions which respond more very reliably across different kinds of tasks when you have more difficulty retrieving the relevant information. So it might be because there's ambiguous concepts, or because there's distractors, or because you've given somebody an irrelevant prime, or because the association that you're trying to retrieve is just very weak because it's a relatively unusual aspect of knowledge, one that you don't encounter very often. And so in the next part of the talk, I'll contrast the semantic control network with a multiple demand network, which is this sort of domain general executive network. And we'll ask if these networks are indeed different and how we can understand why they are where they are on the cortical surface. So the first study I thought I'd tell you about is looking at the role of these different networks in different types of semantic retrieval. So we can contrast sort of more creative patterns of retrieval where you're doing something a bit unusual with your concepts with more habitual patterns of semantic cognition where perhaps everybody in the room would tend to generate the same kinds of responses. So this is work that was led by Katja Redwood, and what she asked people to do was to generate associations to word pairs. So rather than what we normally do is give people a pair of words and ask them to decide yes or no, are they related? But in this experiment, participants had to come up with a link for themselves. And that's kind of cool because you can give two completely unrelated words, and people can still come up with a link between these basically unrelated concepts. Your semantic system is remarkably flexible. So first of all, this is just a parametric effect of the strength of association between the two words. And the areas in red are the areas that respond more when the words that the participant's trying to link are less related in meaning, so weakly associated. And that corresponds quite nicely to some of the key regions of the semantic control network, particularly the left inferior frontal gyrus. So one thing we asked people to do was rate how they were coming up with these associations, because we're aware of the fact that if you ask people to generate a link between two words, they'll use any resources they can identify, including, for example, episodic memory. On those trials in which participants said to us that they had used more episodic memory resources, if you like, to come up with a link, then we found this pattern of brain activation, which overlaps actually with the default mode network. And it also overlaps with those parts of the brain which responded more when participants were linking strong associations, particularly in posterior cingulate cortex, is associated with coming up with links with very strongly connected words, especially when you're using episodic memory. And behaviorally and in terms of the brain, there seemed to be this connection between using episodic memory and having very strongly connected concepts. Perhaps it's the case that if you have two words which are highly related, then, dog and lead, for example, it's so easy to come up with an episodic memory which links those concepts. That's what people tend to do. We also looked at the uniqueness of each person's response. So when they said how their words were linked, we looked to see how many other participants had come up with a similar kind of link, or how kind of bonkers or out there the participant's response was. And when participants came up with a more individual response that other people didn't share, you can see more activation of the semantic control network. Again, this semantic control response to unique responses overlaps with areas associated with weak associations. And so this is evidence that there are different kinds of networks important for different aspects of semantic retrieval. And you can see dissociations between these networks when you start to decompose how people are doing a task. So we can see these dissociations between networks, but the next study I wanted to present to you asks the question, can we actually move activation along the cortical surface as we modulate the task demands? So this was work that was again led by Shui Wang. And in this task, people are making judgments about visual features. So, for example, color. They're matching the concepts based on their color features. And what we manipulated was orthogonal to the task demands, but we manipulated how related the two concepts are to each other more globally. So, for example, people can link tomato and postbox because they're both red, at least in the UK, postboxes are red. But those two concepts don't share any other features. Then they can link strawberry and raspberry, but of course these are both fruits and highly related concepts, so they also have similar colors. And then an intermediate trial will be sort of sweet corn and buttercup. They're both yellow, they're both plants, but they're not that related. So in the middle, this is the uncorrected map, just looking at the parametric effect of this effect of global semantic similarity. And you can see that there are some regions which seem to respond more when there's lots of features shared, and others that respond more when there's very few features shared. And what we were interested in is this kind of parametric effect of global semantic similarity correlated with the principal gradient? And on the right-hand side, this is another of these sort of bin analyses looking at ROIs moving along the principal gradient, looking at the parametric effect of global semantic similarity, and you can see that there's a systematic transition from sensory motor regions which respond more when there's very few semantic features shared between the concepts being linked, up to the default mode network, red network in bin 10, where these items respond more when there's lots of features between the concepts being linked. We were also interested in whether the principal gradient and this sort of effective feature similarity, which correlates with the principal gradient, could explain the order of networks which are important for semantic cognition along the cortical surface. So there are 4 networks here that are relevant for semantic processing. We've got the default mode network at the top. We've got areas of the semantic control network in green. Because the semantic control network overlaps with the multiple demand network, then that overlap, the areas of overlap are shown in the cyan color, and then the multiple demand network, which isn't implicated in semantic control, is in dark blue. And both the connectivity gradient, the principal gradient of connectivity, and this effective feature similarity in our task could, to some extent, capture the order of networks along the cortical surface. So given the semantic control network and the multiple demand network do overlap, it's, a very pertinent question is, to what extent are these two networks definitely different? Because after all, they both play a role in control. Given that a lot of semantic tasks involve language, and a lot of other executive tasks involve other domains like spatial cognition, any differences between these networks might also reflect what type of processing you're doing, especially the role of language. So this was a study led by Jiao Gao, where we compared the effect of difficulty in the semantic domain by modulating strength of association, and the effect of working memory load in a verbal letter-based task, where you have to maintain more letters or fewer letters. And at the bottom, we've just got the areas of response to difficulty in the two tasks when they're contrasted. So we've got semantic-specific areas, especially in the left inferior frontal gyrus, in red. And we've got some areas that are important for working memory load, which are distinct, in right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the pre-supplementary motor area, or the medial prefrontal cortex, the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex at the bottom, seems to be relevant for both kinds of tasks, actually. So that's part of the multiple demand network. So just to sort of clinch it, this is an ROI analysis looking at the different functional networks of interest. So in red, we've got semantic regions from a semantic meta-analysis, but these are regions which are not implicated in control outside the control network. In yellow, we've got areas that are implicated in semantic control. In green, these are semantic control areas that also overlap with the domain general executive network, the multiple demand network. And then in blue, we've got the multiple demand network that's not implicated in semantics. And what you can see is that, so in the bar chart at the bottom, the related and unrelated trials are both from the semantic task. So irrespective of whether you're deciding that the pair of words is related or is unrelated, the difficulty of that decision is associated with more activation in the semantic control network and not in the multiple demand network. the working memory load manipulation actually modulated activation within the part of the semantic control network which is also in the multiple demand network. So that might be because we're using a verbal task, whereas other studies have tended to use spatial tasks, as I mentioned. So there's one last analysis that GI performed, which is looking at essentially a kind of classification of difficulty across these tasks. So we've got two kinds of decoding analysis that we can perform. One is looking at the effect of difficulty within the semantic domain. So looking at the effect of difficult related semantic judgments. And whether the multivariate pattern response related to difficulty for the related associations predicts the patterns related for the unrelated trials. And actually, all four networks can do this kind of classification of difficulty within the semantic domain between related and unrelated trials. But there's clearly a very big difference when we look at cross-domain classification of difficulty. So this is looking at a classifier that's been trained on the semantic task and then tested on working memory load or vice versa. And you can see that only the multiple demand network and the part of the semantic control network which is within the multiple demand network can cross-classify task difficulty in this way. Okay, so I've shown you that in that previous study, the semantic control network is highly left lateralized. Actually, we know this from a huge number of different studies over the years. It's strongly left lateralized network. But this gives us a puzzle, because if the semantic control network is spatially juxtaposed between the default mode network and the multiple demand network, then why is it left lateralized? Because there's plenty of places in the right hemisphere where these two networks could interact. So that doesn't entirely make sense. So we started to wonder whether the two hemispheres might have kind of control subnetworks which are specialized to support different kinds of interactions, perhaps where control has to interact with the top of the gradient versus the bottom of the gradient. So this is work that was done by Tirso Gonzalez-Alam, and he's contrasting the principal gradient values between the two hemispheres, looking at particularly at the 17 network parcellation from Yo and colleagues in 2011. And so the networks where we find higher gradient values in the left hemisphere shown in red, and you can see there's some similarity between these red regions and the semantic control network. So areas that are in the semantic control network might have a tendency to be sort of higher up the gradient and interact more easily with the default mode network in the left hemisphere. Areas that were higher in the right hemisphere on the principal gradient are generally visual cortex, some limbic regions, and temporoparietal junction. And just to kind of clinch it in terms of showing that these differences actually matter for behavior, this is an analysis of a cohort of just over 200 people we have in York who've done different tasks, some semantic tasks, some other sort of non-semantic tasks. And we find a correlation between how far up the principal gradient control B is, so that the difference between left and right hemisphere for control B predicts semantic performance. So people who are better at semantic tasks tend to have this control B network being further up the principal gradient in the left hemisphere compared with the right hemisphere. There was one other network which showed this kind of pattern, but it showed a significant association, but it was a very different pattern. So better performance on Raven's matrices was predicted by the dorsal attention network B being lower in the left hemisphere or higher in the right hemisphere. So this is kind of evidence, I think, for some degree of specialization of control processes in the left and right hemispheres. Okay, I've got two more kind of quick examples for you, and then I'll wrap up. So, so far I've described the networks implicated in semantic cognition as if they're sort of fixed entities. But of course we know that that's not what networks are actually like. Networks show dynamic patterns of coupling depending on the task. And so in this next study that was led by Rocco Chu, we wanted to look at this sort of dynamic network coupling. And Rocco compared easy and hard semantic judgments, where you have to choose the odd one out, and easy and hard spatial judgments, visual spatial judgments, where you have to choose the odd one out. This slide just shows sort of replications of what I've already shown you, really. So semantic control demands, so the hard over easy semantic judgments, activated regions towards the top end, the default mode end of the principal gradient, whereas difficulty in the visual spatial domain was associated with greater activation in attention networks towards the bottom of the gradient. And we can also see that there's a sort of a topographical shift in these networks. In a couple of brain regions, we can see this particularly clearly in the parietal cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. The blue network is the effective difficulty in the visual spatial domain, so that's essentially the multiple demand network. Then the red map is semantic difficulty, and semantic control map. And then the green is the effective easiness in the visual spatial domain, which essentially gives us the default mode network. And you can see these networks transition along the cortical surface. But in order to look at flexible patterns of coupling, Rocco looked at an analysis using psychophysical interactions with the left inferior frontal gyrus as a seed. And so he's asking, how does the left inferior frontal gyrus connect with other brain regions when you're doing easy versus hard semantic and visual spatial tasks? Essentially, in essence, what he found was that the left inferior frontal gyrus shows more connectivity to visual and attention regions when you're doing a demanding semantic task. So that's the orange networks in the top picture. In contrast, left inferior frontal gyrus joins together with other default mode network regions when you're doing, the visual spatial task. So it's as if it isolates itself from the control networks when you're not needing it to perform the control demanding task. And this is our last study. We wanted to know what's the consequence of this dynamic pattern of coupling for information processing. So here we can ask, as the task demands change, how does the multivariate neural pattern change? So this is analysis done by Jiao Gao, who looked at, he did a reanalysis of that data I already showed you looking at creativity, so the more unique versus more habitual kind of productions that people made when they were given pairs of words. And it's an analysis of what's often referred to as informational connectivity. So this is a metric that captures the multivariate similarity across brain regions as you move through an experiment, different points in time or different trials. And the assumption is that if, so imagine you've got two different kinds of trials. And there's multivariate difference in the pattern that those trials produce in one brain area. If another brain area correlates with the same kinds of difference, it shows the same kinds of differences at the same time points, then the idea is that these brain networks, these regions must be exchanging information in some way. So rather than having a particular seed region like the left inferior frontal gyrus, in this analysis we did an analysis that was more of a sort of whole brain decomposition. And so we started with a 400 parcellation of the brain again. We computed the informational connectivity metric between every pair of parcels. That gave us a 400 by 400 matrix, and then we could decompose that matrix to identify the principal components of this type of connectivity to do with the multivariate patterns that brain regions respond to following a task. And you can see that, I'm sorry I've not used the same color scale, but you can see that essentially there's a very high spatial correlation between the key dimension, the one that explains the most variance for intrinsic connectivity on the left-hand side, and our new metric now, which is the principal gradient of informational connectivity on the right-hand side. And this shows us that this separation between heteromodal cortex and unimodal cortex is so profoundly important for explaining cortical organization. It doesn't really matter what metric you feed into your analysis, you'll recover the same kind of dimension. But what we were really interested in, of course, was what's the difference in informational connectivity as a response to the task demands. And so in this picture that I've put up here, what we're doing is comparing the gradient values in the informational connectivity space for trials where the association strength was strong versus weak. So the red regions are the areas where the principal gradient values in informational connectivity were higher when association strength was stronger. And what this shows us is that towards the top end of the principal gradient, especially regions of the semantic control network, we've got regions which tend to be sharing information with the default mode network when associations are strong, but then tend to take more information or show a greater similarity with the multivariate patterns in more unimodal or attentional regions when associations are weak. And this helps us to understand how we can generate different patterns of retrieval from the semantic system depending on the task demands. When the semantic control network kind of couples with the top end of the gradient, the default mode network, then what you can produce is what your long-term memory system can give you. But when you sort of break this coupling and start to couple those semantic control network regions with features of the with the unimodal cortex, then you can generate more unusual patterns of semantic retrieval. Oh, sorry, this just shows that the biggest difference is in the semantic control network. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly wrap up. So I've shown you that semantic networks form an orderly sequence on the cortical surface from the default mode network through the semantic control network to the multiple demand network. I've shown you one example of how recruitment can move along the principal gradient depending on task demands, in particular the alignment between what you're trying to do and the structure of your long-term memory. I think I've shown you some examples of how the semantic control network and the multiple demand network are spatially distinct. So they're differently lateralized, with only the semantic control network being left lateralized. And they also have different locations on the principal gradient of connectivity, with the semantic control network being higher up or closer to the default mode network. And I've also shown that regions of the semantic control network are higher on the principal gradient in the left hemisphere. So this laterality might reflect the ability of the semantic control regions to couple with the default mode network regions in service of semantic cognition. And then I've also talked about how retrieval demands affect information processing. I've shown you that there are different patterns that relate to difficulty.
I'm sorry, how much more time?
I'm just finishing. Am I running out of time? Yeah, so this is just the last slide or two.
3 minutes?
Yeah, that would be more than enough, sorry. So different patterns to do with difficulty in these networks. And I've also shown how the semantic control network shows dynamic patterns of dynamic changes in connectivity as the control demands change. So it couples more to sensory, motor, and attention regions when you're doing hard semantic tasks. And it couples more to more default mode regions when you're either doing easy semantic tasks or when you're not doing semantics at all. And so what I'm arguing is that strong separation between the ends of the principal gradient might allow semantic cognition to unfold kind of without constraint. And when there's less separation between the unimodal and the heteromodal regions, that's when you can get more constraint on what your semantic system is producing. So the take-home message is that the topographical separation of unimodal and heteromodal cortex is key to both conceptual representation and flexibility in conceptual retrieval. There are lots of unresolved issues. We can come back to these. I imagine some people will be thinking along these lines, but there are multiple gradients. We don't know how smooth they are, and we don't really know how information integration happens in the brain. But thank you to all the members of the Flex group at the University of York and all my lovely collaborators, including lots of people I haven't listed here, but these are the people who influenced the work all the way through. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Beth. That was exactly 45 minutes, so thanks for that. Okay, questions, please.
Hi, thanks. Really interesting talk. I just wanted to ask a question about the informational connectivity towards the end. It can, that changes somewhat significantly usually with the conditions that you choose, right? You're looking at the confusability of your particular conditions. So I can imagine you could do, different associations, like you sort of mentioned, there was a relationship, different categories, all sorts of things, and at least in certain circumstances, it will change. In fact, I think in the original paper, Sharon and I described it as being like a bit of analogous to PPI, because you can change the conditions, in a univariate sense, as opposed to sort of functional connectivity. So I'm just curious what those conditions were, if you tried different ones, and how you think the results might change if you change those.
Okay, thanks very much. That's a fabulous question. I'm afraid I cut out the control analysis just for the interest of time, but we also analysed a kind of chevron task, which was non-semantic, and you don't get the same change in the principal gradient for that task. There are actually significant differences. I don't know what they mean, so that might be like part of what you're kind of driving at. I don't believe that these metrics are likely to recover, genuinely sort of neural representation similarities across brain regions. What's more likely is that we're looking at similarities in patterns of connectivity in the case of like large-scale organization of connectivity, and that's why this sort of principal component approach works quite well. For both the chevron task and the semantic task, when you just look at the principal component of informational connectivity, it looks just like the the principal gradient of intrinsic connectivity. So that kind of topographical landscape, if you like, is identical. But as you say, then the flux in that landscape will depend on the task. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I have two questions. One question I'm sure you've been asked many times. The first one is, well, why would you think that distance along the cortex should matter as opposed to subcortical connections that are directly possibly connecting these regions?
That's a very good question. And actually, to be honest, they kind of push you in the same direction. So local connectivity is dominant. For any brain region, the way that it will respond is going to be very strongly influenced by the brain regions directly next to it. And that's essentially what the principal gradient of intrinsic connectivity is picking up on. That similarity to your local neighbors. Long-range white matter connections help to support the top end of the principal gradient. So there must be long-range connections between, for example, those highly separated default mode hub regions, which support the top end of the gradient. So actually, when you look at white matter connections, you see that you can recapitulate the same kind of relationships, and you see that at the top end of the gradient, the strongest white matter connections are also to other regions at the top end of the gradient, for example. So those two aspects of connectivity are pushing our brain in the same direction, which I think is quite interesting. Topography matters in the sense that it would give us a space in which processing could change relatively gradually. But there might be sharp transitions in functions which are actually exactly to do with where these terminations of the white matter bundles are. So it's a really interesting, I don't think I know the answer, but it's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Okay, well, part two, I'll try to put it as provocatively as possible since this is chaos, but I can't think of any, is there another example from biology that exhibits graded structure in its functional organization? I mean, it seems to me that every other biological system that we can point to, from the cell up through the structure of the brain, has separable functional organization that can be tied to certain structures. So why do you think the organization of the brain is the exception to biology? Number one, and the follow-up is, do you think this is a reflection of our measure as opposed to a reflection of the underlying organization of the brain? I mean, is this a reflection of the way in which we quantify responses using these techniques like fMRI, that we don't really give it an opportunity to show us an alternative to a graded measure? Okay,
fantastic. So I think I understand your question. I don't disagree with you, I don't think. So I don't think that this is an exception to the general way that biology works. I mean, when you look at cell differentiation, for example, you see that there can be local patches of differentiated tissue, which is a bit like the cortex. So you get like local patches of functional tuning which are distinct from neighboring regions. And yet at the same time, when you take a step back and you look at how the system is organized, there can also be large-scale trends in organization. So I think that the answer to the question will depend on the spatial scale at which you're looking. And I alluded to this kind of notion of interdigitation on the kind of puzzles remaining slide, because we know that, I think probably ubiquitously across the cortex, if you look at a sort of network that you might have uncovered at the largest scale of organization at the whole brain level, if you look within that network, you'll find patches which have different tuning to different kinds of, reflecting connectivity to different networks. Rob Leach, for example, calls them echoes. These are kind of different patches which might get, relatively speaking, more input from one region than another. And that might be important for actually what makes the principal gradient emerge. So the kinds of interdigitated networks you see in the default mode network will be different from the ones you might get in visual cortex, for example, like different features being interdigitated, perhaps progressively more sophisticated or integrated features being interdigitated at different levels of the hierarchy, but I'm massively speculating now. I feel like you asked another question, which I failed to... Oh, it was about whether it's the methods. So you might be alluding to the fact that there's a lack of spatial resolution in some of the methods that we're presenting. I mean, this, obviously we can't... Well, We can't very easily see interdigitation in group-level analyses because the regions which get interdigitated might be in spatially different locations. And so, although actually, to be honest, sometimes we do see interdigitation even at the group level, so that's kind of interesting. I think they are quite profound effects. But we have done some of these analyses in single subjects, and you can still find the systematic change in cortical responses, for example, along the principal gradient, depending on the task demands, the study by Shui Wang that I talked about. We did that in the individual subjects too. Yes, so I think that there are definitely, you know, I kind of believe it all fits together, actually, that what we can see at the local scale will help us to explain what's going on at the global scale. Hope that answered your question.
Thanks a lot. It was a very nice talk, and I thought about similar considerations as the previous question that was asked. And because of that, I was thinking, suppose you would have the perfect data set, at least what I would consider perfect data set. You would have like thousands of electrodes in the brain, and you would have them placed very close to each other, and you would be able to actually measure very local signals, maybe even action potentials. Do you think you would still see the gradients? Or are the gradients most clear if you can sort of get rid of the local noise in a sense?
I think if you fed the analysis the entire brain, then you would still recover the principal gradient. And that's because the maximum differences in the functional response to a task, if you could do single-cell recording or recording of the whole brain, would show the maximum differences between heteromotor and unimodal cortex still. The problem is, of course, we can't, that's a thought experiment that we can't do. But I don't know whether you'd get the principal gradient out of kind of more local patches of cortex from those kinds of data sets. One thing I do know is that you've got to be a bit wary of local gradients. And one reason for that is because they quite often reflect the sort of spatial dimensions of a region of interest. So because brain regions are so strongly influenced or so similar to what's right next to them, the similarity tends to be very strongly driven by the shape of the ROI. And sometimes, I think even if you feed if you feed algorithms to identify local gradients noise, you can still recover what looks like spatial change. So you need to be a bit careful. So I think it would work best if you had large coverage. But thanks very much for the question.
And instead of seeing the two as opposite things, like the local organization, the local topography, and the gradient, do you think that your results would become even better if somehow you would sort of inform your distance metric by some sort of information of the local shape of the regions? Because I think now it works partially, I think, because you sort of you average across the whole brain, in a sense, your distance metric. So if there's a local deformation somewhere, that will sort of average out with another local deformation somewhere else. But you would consider all of that noise, I think, in the way you compute the distance. But could you make it even better by taking that into account?
I mean, not necessarily noise. There are, in the principal gradient, there are some areas which show very sharp transitions, even between the top and the bottom ends of the gradient. A classic case would be visual cortex right next door to PCC.
Okay, so the analysis would pick that up already.
So there are areas where the principal gradient is kind of like compressed into very little space, but the principal gradient might like reflect the dominant patterns of the whole cortex, which is like the long axis of the brain from anterior to posterior, captures that separation quite nicely.
Okay, all right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much for your presentation. I really like the approach, the sort of network neuroscience approach, if I may describe it like that. What I haven't really seen is the clear link to the task representations. I know you have different tasks, but it's more a question sort of where you see the field moving towards. Is it possible to, because I think then you have a real breakthrough, connect this sort of network perspective with the actual task dynamics, and I'm talking about sort of information representation in cognitive neuroscience experiments. If you could elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
Yes, it would be fabulous to get at the way that information is represented. I don't think we're very close to knowing the answer to that question at the moment. We know that decoding of task goals, for example, can happen quite, you know, for example, in the default mode network will capture information about the task you're trying to perform, and the harder you make the task, sometimes the greater you can decode that information. So information is clearly flowing into the default mode network from regions that are lower down the gradient, if you like, that might be more about like attention mechanisms or something. The default mode network probably copies information about, you know, what your what's important for your conscious experience at a given moment. But yeah, I think you're right. That would be a really interesting way for this field to develop. But I haven't really had a lot of success yet in understanding those kinds of relationships. I mean, one thing we've tried to do is look at representations of concepts based on what they mean individually versus what they might mean in a context. But the brain just basically represents what they mean in the context, and it's very hard to recover any regions which represent what they mean individually. So far, I haven't found any kind of functional gradients that relate to informational representation in that way that you're asking me about. But it would be great if we could. Yeah, thank you.
Anybody? All right, we do have a few more minutes, so Beth, let me take the prerogative of the chair, and just to help me better understand the spoke and hub idea. So I'll just make a statement and tell me where I've gone wrong. But it really sounds like the model in itself greatly overemphasizes the contribution of the anterior temporal lobe, and at the same time greatly reduces the contribution of the rest of the brain to conceptual representation. So, for example, I think there's lots of evidence now that whatever's going on back in the fusiform is already quite abstract and abstracted away from certainly sensory information, whereas the model looks like completely bottom-up input of just modality. So where have I gone wrong with that?
Interesting question. So yeah, I'm sure you haven't gone wrong. I mean, you're right that the fusiform cortex is representing information that's essentially semantic. When we observe what the fusiform is doing, it will be a consequence of the way that information has been processed by the brain. So, you know, essentially it's kind of interactional system. It's very difficult to decompose the functional relevance of an individual element in such a system. It might be that, you know, computational modeling is one way to help us to understand how the different elements work together to give rise to these representations. But you know, very often when you look at, you know, like the example I alluded to a minute ago, very often when you look at what is apparently being represented, at least in fMRI, by different brain regions, the answer is it's the same stuff everywhere. So it's quite difficult to come up with, you know, sort of functional representational differences. That's not to say they don't exist, but it's quite difficult. Certainly with the timescale of fMRI, it's almost impossible, I think, to identify those kinds of relationships.
But why the emphasis on modality itself?
Why the emphasis on modality?
That it's just, well, maybe I don't understand what you mean by modality. So the way it's shown up there is you've got undifferentiated visual, auditory, and I guess tactile information. So what is that?
Okay, yeah. So you're talking about the fact that, for example, there's different, you know, the visual cortex is not a kind of like all one thing. There's multiple different pathways. I mean, one of the things we've been looking at recently are different pathways from visual cortex to default mode network, which seem to essentially relate to different, what Daniel would probably refer to as different zones of the principal gradient. So the principal gradient is like a superordinate beast capturing similarity at a very gross spatial scale between different brain regions. But of course, that's not to say that parietal cortex does exactly the same as temporal cortex, which does exactly the same as frontal cortex. We don't believe that. And of course, the evidence shows that that's not the case. So the challenge is perhaps to understand what's differentiating those pathways and the types of visual information that's being represented in, for example, more medial and lateral parts of visual cortex. is part of the story that gives rise to functional differentiation within the default mode network, where you have, for example, the kind of relational coding that we were talking about in the hippocampus earlier, being distinct from perhaps the long-term semantic store, which I think that the temporal cortex is more important for. I don't know if that answers your question, Alex, but it's a really interesting point for debate.
Thanks. Well, it sounds like we're not going to have a debate, that's for sure. So, Beth, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.